koutou tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Ki te atua tēnā koe. Ki te papatūnuku tēnā koe. Ki te Zoom tēnā koe. Ki te hunga mate. Ki te hunga ora. Tēnā koutou katoa. So hi dear friends. Thank you all so much for joining us over Zoom, and for those who are joining us from all over the world. Thank you so much for making the time to be here with us. If this is your first time joining us in Spirit of Work, welcome. So Spirit of Work is a networking and discourse forum about the application of moral, ethical, and spiritual principles in our workplace. So it aims to bring together experienced and young professionals to share and learn about creating vibrant, sustainable, and productive work environments through the application of spiritual principles. So Spirit of Work organizes sessions that provide fresh insight, as we'll see today, into applying spiritual principles to various aspects of our work life. And these principles do take inspiration from the Baha'i writings, and they serve as foundations for transforming work by contributing to individual development, organizational growth, and community development as well. So we're really happy to have you all here. Today, we're really lucky, and we have a speaker who's joining us from overseas as well. Her name is Maja Groff. I'll give her a brief introduction. So Maja is an international lawyer. She's based in The Hague, which I'm sure we've all heard about. She assists in the development and servicing of multilateral treaties. She works at various international criminal tribunals. She teaches at the Hague Academy of International Law, and she's currently a visiting scholar at Leiden University. So I think it's safe to say that we are truly lucky to have her here tonight, and thank you so much, Maja, for joining us. She's also drafted a wide range of international legal policy documents, and she's published academically on private and public international law, human rights, global governance. She's published a book this year, actually. She was the co-author of a book called Global Governance and the Emergence of Global Institutions for the 21st Century, which she'll be discussing some tonight, I'm sure. So Maja, please take the floor, take the Zoom. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much, Sophia. And thank you everybody for being here, whatever time zone you're in. It is 7 a.m. here in The Hague, so I'm really happy to have this meaningful discussion first thing in the morning. Wonderful, so yeah, I'll just talk. I have a PowerPoint and I'll give you some thoughts on the global risks we're confronting, global governance, and then at the end, hopefully we can have a good discussion, and there will be lots of time for questions, comments. And I will just share my PowerPoint. So, as Sophia mentioned, I've been working recently on sort of global governance thinking, where we're at the international level in terms of our current global governance architecture, and what some of the global risks we're confronting are and how to respond adequately. And yeah, and then Mark added the tagline, because this is a Spirit of Work series, on the globalization of spirituality. So let's talk a little bit about that at the end and your thoughts, and I'll share a few perspectives. And just a quick disclaimer that, of course, today I'm speaking in my personal capacity and not on behalf of any organization. So where do we currently stand in terms of our global challenges, global risks? Some of you might have seen this October 2018 special report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where in sort of a different tone, they urged the rapid action around the world to transform our global economy at a speed and scale that has no documented historic precedent. So the IPCC is an international UN-based global scientific monitoring body for climate, and usually they're very careful with their scientific prognosis of global climate change. And this was a very, very interesting report and point where they're telling the world, the international community, that they really have to take this action, which has also no documented historic precedent. So this is quite interesting because I don't know if this has filtered through all of our societies yet in terms of really the action that is required if we're going to tackle this challenge of climate change, which is indeed linked to other very major global environmental challenges. So you see the second quote on the slide, also from 2018, from the Global Biodiversity Governance Regime, which is also another very weak by design international regime. And the warning from the Executive Secretary of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity saying that if the world does not thrash out a new effective deal, humanity could be the first species to document its own extinction. So again, rather serious circumstances and a rather serious challenge. Now, fast forward to this year, there was just another UN report released noting that not a single target has been met to stem the destruction of wildlife and life-sustaining ecosystems in the last decade. So countries are still trying to collaborate, most of them, and work together on the Biodiversity Convention on climate change, but not really tackling these extraordinary and rather existential global challenges. So I wanted to play you this video, but I don't think the PowerPoint will play a video and allow you to hear this message. But in one of my research capacities on global governance and climate governance, I'm working with this Swedish scientist who's the head of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And he was just giving an update this month to us, and this was for a UN Global Compact event on the newest research in the set of scientific planetary boundaries. And where we're at as a species, we've overstepped a number of these planetary boundaries already. We're already in orange, warning or red zones in a number of these interrelated planetary boundaries. One of them is biodiversity, one of them is climate. There's other biological planetary scientific cycles that are interrelated. And he was also noting that we've reached a tipping point across a number of these sort of key global ecosystem tipping points. For example, I believe one is the Arctic system, there's the Amazon, and these different global tipping points or ecosystems, once one of them starts to degrade or become unstable, there are then knock-on cascading effects across the planetary system. And this science, while it is excellent at this point, there are still so many unknowns, and it's very unclear how all of these changes will interact and what the consequences will be on the global environmental systems, and then of course for us and our civilizations. Now, also, if that wasn't enough for us to be confronting, we have some rather interesting geopolitical dynamics restarting, or perhaps they never really went away. And this is a quote from the Swedish Institute for Peace Research in Stockholm, saying that we're really moving into an unpredictable global geopolitical constellation where bipolarity doesn't work as a model, where unipolarity, of the US being dominant doesn't work. So political scientists note that in such a shifting kind of global power configuration, it's highly unstable and there's possibility for renewed conflict. And these sorts of situations, resurgence of these superpower or great power contests, which one of the symptoms was the US and Russia withdrawing from some bilateral, very, very important bilateral arms treaties that were done after the Cold War. So this prompted Gorbachev to write this editorial in the New York Times in the fall of 2018, which I think he's very blunt and rational and clear about the consequences. He says, "Yet I am convinced that those who hope to benefit from a global free-for-all are deeply mistaken. There will be no winner in a war of all against all, particularly if it ends in nuclear war," because some of the key treaties are treaties about nuclear weapons. So yes, this is disturbing, and also something that humanity assumed was solved after the Cold War. And I think this is an interesting statistic comparing our tolerance of risk in the area of climate change versus our tolerance of risk in airplane safety, another globally regulated endeavor. So if dying in a flight accident was as likely as a 3°C global temperature increase, then the number of people dying in airplanes every year would be 15 million. So that's just to illustrate to you the level of risks. We're currently headed potentially to 3 or 4 degrees based on action of countries. And we know this is an extremely dangerous global temperature rise. The Paris Agreement between countries in 2015 was to keep global temperatures below a 2°C, well below a 2°C rise. And this set of converging global risks prompted the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in early 2020 to put their so-called doomsday clock at 100 seconds to midnight, which is closer than perhaps it has ever been, certainly since the Cold War. And you can see the quote there about what they see this convergence of risk as. Quote, "Humanity continues to face two existential dangerous simultaneously, nuclear war and climate change, that are compounded by a threat multiplier, cyber-enabled information warfare, undercutting society's ability to respond. International security situation is dire, not only because these threats exist, but because the world leaders have allowed the international political infrastructure for managing them to erode." So that's very interesting also for people like me working on global governance, that this Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which includes an extraordinary group of esteemed scientists, many of who are Nobel Prize winners, to sort of make this diagnosis about where we're at. So where do we go from here? Some of you may know that this year was the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And you can see here a comment, a quotation from Fabrizio Hochschild, who's the Undersecretary General and Special Advisor for preparations for UN 75 commemorations at the UN. So he works directly with the UN Secretary General. And this is a statement he made on the launch of our book, which Mark mentioned. So basically noting, we have this constellation of challenges, old and new. The UN is increasingly overstretched and underfunded. And there's a lot of commentary now because some very large countries are questioning multilateralism and international institutions. Thinkers, scholars are noting, a crisis of multilateralism. So just when our crises, are sort of converging and most intense, we see this backing away from international institutions and cooperation. So this is the book that Mark mentioned, and in it was published in January 2020. In it, Augusto, Arthur, and I make a set of sort of comprehensive systemic proposals for very substantial UN reform, sort of the next generation of UN effectiveness and capacity to manage global risks in a way that's more democratically accountable, in conformity with human rights, international rule of law. And we make these proposals not only because the risks at this moment in our collective history are so dire, but also simply because the UN Charter, which here's a little copy of it, the UN Charter, which was adopted after the Second World War in 1945, has not really been amended in 75 years. There have been little targeted, tiny little amendments in a few places, but it has not been subject to a comprehensive review. And such a comprehensive review was anticipated by those negotiating the UN Charter in San Francisco in 1975, especially the middle power and smaller states who were concerned about the veto of the large states on the Security Council. So that was actually architected into the Charter. There should be a review within 10 years, that is to say in 1955, but that never happened. The world went into the Cold War and things got basically deadlocked. So this is a slide that shows, you know, some of the comprehensive reforms are like a very broad brush sketch of what we're proposing in our book, even though we've updated some of this and tweaked some of it, but just to enhance the legislative capacity and legitimacy of the UN, having a proper, you know, executive function that's not paralyzed by the veto, and having a genuine international rule of law. And I'll talk about just a few examples of these reforms in a moment so you have an idea. Undersecretary General Hochschild talked about, you know, this crisis of multilateralism. And I would say there's also some very good news on that front that, for example, France and Germany started about a year ago an alliance for multilateralism of middle power states. So the foreign ministers got together and used their convening power to start a really now substantial group of states around the world. There are probably about 60 or 80 by this time, who are committed to a rules-based international order, to democracy, to human rights, to the rule of law, and are trying to work together as much as they can to strengthen global cooperation around certain issues. And they just had these wonderful statements last week on the occasion of UN 75, affirming really a very positive vision for the world and our international society. So we'll see how this evolves and if they can really play a leadership in the world. So as you saw on that slide about our book, we're proposing some international legal reforms, and this is just another shorter policy document if you're interested that was recently published at the Stimson Center, which is a think tank in the US, on like a rule of law package, strengthening the rules-based global order. There probably aren't too many lawyers on this call, but anyway, if anyone is interested in global legal reform, this paper exists on the Stimson website. It's a bit more digestible, and we hope to also share it with this Alliance for Multilateralism soon. So yeah, I'll just focus very briefly on a few of our proposals for reform in the book. So firstly, on the legal front, the International Court of Justice, which is here in The Hague, which is a central institution for the peaceful settlement of disputes among states. So both the League of Nations Charter, Covenant, and then also the UN Charter were meant to shift state behavior from settling disputes or conflicts through war to settling their disputes through third-party dispute settlement, arbitration, mediation, and then adjudication through this new international court, which has its seat in The Hague. And it's supposed to be the primary judicial organ for the United Nations, where member states can bring cases against each other. However, it has always had the quality as a voluntary institution. So states can actively decide whether they want to go to the court or not, and to be party to a case at the court in general. So it's a very strange way to conceive of a court, where it's optional, you know, for a defendant, for example, to appear in essence. There is a clause in its statute where states can accept the compulsory jurisdiction of the court, but only about 40% of UN members have done so. and many of them who have done so then carve out a lot of exceptions where they won't be held to account at the court. There's some other problems which I won't go into, but just making the point that this was sort of a first draft that was adopted in 1945, and it could quite easily be upgraded to the next generation of international court, which indeed states like Australia and New Zealand argued that it should be a binding mandatory international court in 1945. So these are just a few aspects of potential reforms to this court. And we're very lucky at this moment in history because we have a number of international courts, for example, those in the European Union of supranational courts between states that we can draw from these models, we can improve upon them, we can really design a really brilliant, effective international judicial institution to further deepen our commitment to a rules-based international order, and one where war, armed conflict is absolutely out of the question and not a method for dispute resolution. Another feature that we propose, of reform that we propose in our book, is the transformation of the UN Security Council to a UN Executive Council. So as I mentioned, the permanent members of the Security Council, that most of you probably know this, but there are 5 members, essentially the victors of World War II, which big powers which got permanent seats on the UN Security Council, and they also have a veto. They can essentially block decisions of the Council, Security Council, which is a very, very important apex organ of the UN. This was a point of contention in 1945 negotiations, and subsequently has been the most frequent subject of UN reform debate of the UN, so much so that the head of UN Geneva a few years ago said that, you know, UN Security Council reform has been a subject of sterile debate, or it's been sterile debate because there have not been consequences in really shifting to a new enhanced Security Council. And what we're proposing in our book is really to shift the paradigm of the Council to make it legitimate, fair, transparent, according to modern standards of governance. That means that every state should be represented through some kind of mechanism. We propose regional seats for regions, and some would still have permanent members, but no veto. Most of the reform proposals at the moment are just to add new countries. So add countries from different regions who would then have these special privileges or powers. And our view is, no, we should really have a fair executive body that has much, much greater legitimacy and is not based on power. Also, in the book, we have a whole chapter on arms control and disarmament, and also establishing a standing UN peace force. Because as you know, places like Rwanda, the lack of actual rapid reaction capacity of the UN led to huge humanitarian disaster and mass atrocity. So the proposals we make in the book are actually based on articles in the Charter that have never been realized. For example, Article 26, that the Security Council would design a global plan for arms control. Also not to waste resources in this area, but to have a very careful, strict global plan. Article 43 was about making agreements to establish global standing forces. That was also never followed through by the Security Council. So the Security Council basically has not done its homework under the Charter. Yeah, so on the military expenditure front, these are just some recent figures. You know, this is from 2008, from CIPRI again, 1.8 trillion a year in global military spending. That was a 2.6% increase. So military spending around the world is now also creeping up because of these power contestations. And I think this quotation from Oscar Arias is very apt. The global arms trade continues to represent the single most significant perversion of worldwide priorities known today. So all this attention and also technological development devoted to, you know, very strange, odd military capacities is a waste of money. It's a waste of human ingenuity to the wrong purposes, where we have these very compelling, urgent global challenges. Also, economists have studied military expenditure in terms of what productive capacity it has in a given economy. And it will be much, much better for your economy if you spend on education, healthcare, etc., like many other things. It's probably obvious, but economists, including at the IMF, there's some reports considering military spending as non-productive economic, you know, governmental spending. So I guess in our book, we basically make the argument is that we have to quote Eleanor Roosevelt, rededicate ourselves to the unfinished task that still lies before us. This was a quotation from her in 1948 on the adoption of the Declaration on Universal Human Rights. And she clearly saw, for example, that human rights had to be fully implemented, and that was the next step. That still hasn't happened around the world. So we have a lot of work to do, you know, along those various different points I mentioned and in other areas that we just have to catch up with some of these key global governance tasks. And now shifting towards, you know, spiritual dimensions and ethical dimensions of this issue, of this international project. Also sociologically speaking, I think the UN, the adoption of the 1945 Charter in particular, can be thought of as a very, very interesting historical moment where we're moving further towards, or we're taking the first very, very important steps towards establishing a so-called peace system at the global level. And I'm drawing from the work of Douglas Fry, who's an anthropologist. He wrote this brilliant short article in the journal Science. This is from 2012. He has a number of other books which are wonderful, talking about what societies around the world with very diverse subgroups have united and found ways to work together peacefully in a sustainable, stable manner. And these are the 6 characteristics that he's found. And you can see on the slide like some of the examples of the various groups. But he notes all of these groups have an overarching social identity, interconnections among subgroups, interdependence, non-warring values, symbolism, and ceremonies that reinforce peace, and then superordinate institutions for conflict management. So the first 5 are sort of a little bit like mostly around the values level, which I think is really, really fascinating and really interesting. And we can all make efforts to cultivate those first 5. They're more sociological. And, you know, today we definitely have a lot of interdependence, as COVID-19 has shown interconnections among subgroups. Also, that's improving, increasing. But do we have yet an overarching global social identity? What about our non-warring values? I know in my country, Canada, we probably in general do and throughout a lot of society, but is that general around the world? Symbolism and ceremonies that reinforce peace. Do we have enough of these at the global level? And I think we really need to look at models of successful global high-tech intensive collaboration. You know, for example, one is the International Space Station. So for me, thinking about global governance, how do we think of, like, you know, these highly technical, you know, scientifically informed sort of international projects with you know, human and humanitarian interests, the interest of all of humanity squarely at the center. How do we think about the focus on them and then expand that spirit of collaboration across so many different areas where we really, really have to work hard together. And in the book, we have a whole chapter on education, which we think is so important. you know, we make the argument that the shared values, for example, in the Charter, that not many people are really broadly educated on, or even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the Sustainable Development Goals, all of those have obligations to educate the general public on their content, but there hasn't really been follow through in general at the national level for people to really understand international institutions, international instruments and treaties. Also, you know, we argue that there needs to be a new generation of skilled global leadership that can think in complex environments, can adapt, can learn, but also has a very, very strong ethical and moral base to work together in the best interests of humanity with a service perspective, rather than just self-interest or careerism or thinking only in a national perspective, to really transcend. I think we need this thinking for this next generation of global challenges. And this is one wonderful initiative of Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the United Nations. It's the Global Citizenship Center in Vienna, where he's working with UNESCO to educate youth around the world in global citizenship and the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is an absolutely wonderful initiative, but how do we expand this and accelerate these sorts of initiatives to really build this sense of community and shared purpose across societies? So yes, back to the question, who are we? Are we indeed one united species, one united global community? Which is very interesting. Of course, the Baha'i faith is very, very clear that humanity is one people, and we should think in this way, that we should think in a united way, think of everybody's well-being. So the question is, yeah, how do we underline this reality in different governmental spaces and different forums where global governance is being discussed? How do we at the national or local level, you know, emphasize this and help to mobilize this awareness to together tackle our global challenges? That in itself is a big challenge. So I will end there with this slide. There's a beautiful photo there of the Peace Palace, where the International Court of Justice is housed here in The Hague. And it's a quote, well, an excerpt from a quote from Andrew Carnegie, the great Scottish-American philanthropist who gave the seed money to build this Peace Palace in The Hague for a library there and for the International Court of Justice. And he says, the highest worship is service to humankind. And this quote also says that he thinks this building in The Hague is the most holy place on earth because it's devoted to service to all of humankind. And he saw this building for the International Court of Justice as a sort of temple for peace, to remind humanity of this goal of international peace, even though it was constructed in 1913, so has lived through two, you know, egregious, horrible, destructive wars. So yeah, I shall end there and really welcome your questions and discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Maya. That was lovely. Your points about, you know, the ICJ and the different arms of the UN and the reform was really, really interesting. I'm sure we'll have quite a few questions for you. So again, if you'd like to either put them in the chat and I'll convey them and I'll pass them through to Maya, or if you'd like to use the raise hand function, I will just put you all onto gallery view so I can see. Sorry, Sean, was that a question? Or was that just raising your hand in real life? Oh, here we go. Here's a question. So, will the book be presented to world leaders and how? And will there be any follow-up discussions with them?
Yes, the book is being sent to a number of current or former leaders through various networks. So that is happening, and also scholars who are influential working in the field. But yeah, in terms of dialogue with leaders, I think, for example, the Alliance for Multilateralism would be a very good network to send the book to, which I might propose to colleagues. But because there hasn't been serious dialogue on such substantial reforms for so many years, like not since the 1950s and 1960s, this book was a big inspiration, World Peace Through World Law, for our writing. And that was 1950s, 1960s, when thinkers more proximate to the UN Charter were thinking, okay, what's the next upgrade to the Charter? Now the world has such a strong path dependency on the current Charter that it's really tough, I think, for some policymakers still to think about even reforming the International Court of Justice, for example, which is it's kind of obvious. It's kind of a no-brainer. So I guess the answer is yes, we will engage. We'll also engage on nearer term UN reforms and try to just have a sort of a safe space so that we can dialogue together and start to think about, the positive outcomes of these various quite substantial reforms. So I think it will take some time. And we're trying to introduce ideas and start dialogues in various places in as constructive way as possible and as inclusive as possible. My hope is really that initiatives like the Alliance for Multilateralism can build their capacity for, leadership of the many based on, a firm values-based commitment, so that, really the common interest of humanity and the necessity of global cooperation can really be put at the forefront, and this values-based sort of international system can just organically keep strengthening that really that's what we need, that the old paradigm of war-based system is really not what we need to be dealing with at this moment.
Great, thank you so much, Maya. We've got another question here from Michael. So he says, what is your view on the role global governance or international law can play to address impacts of COVID-19 and prevent another global catastrophe like another pandemic?
Yeah, so the proposals in our book, our argument is that if the UN as a system increases its capacity as a governance system as a whole, this will greatly assist in managing, a whole host of global risks. So for example, the WHO, they had, fairly good regulations in place that were ratified by virtually every state in the world that were considered binding, when COVID was first arising and spreading, but they had no enforcement power for these regulations. Also, there's chronic funding problems where, one state or two states can kind of hold the organization hostage or, undermine its activities. And we also address funding, having stable, sustainable funding for the UN system. So, our bigger picture view is if you really increase the whole system governance, including making international law justiciable, you can actually go to a court to have it enforced, and also enforceable, that it's actually enforced, not just a promise or something on a paper. This will help across a whole range of areas, including global pandemics. So yeah, I mean, in terms of global pandemics, WHO has to be strengthened in all of those ways, you know, in the near term, but there's like some crucial global structural issues also that need to be overcome, as we discuss in the book.
Cool. We've got a few questions. So Mark says, what role can a country like New Zealand play to help bring about these kinds of reforms to the global system of governance? How do we bring about change?
Yeah, I think a country like New Zealand or Netherlands, where I am, or Canada, my home country, can have a huge impact, and I've seen that regularly, on a regular basis, where one individual country or group of countries, if they bring a really sound, thoughtful proposal to the international community, and they also, for example, build support with other like-minded states in advance of sort of bringing or launching a proposal, can have enormous impact and can be really effective. Like in researching this book, for example, on the International Court of Justice, I found very few proposals even on reform of the court by any states. So this, you know, no states have even devoted the sort of policy or technical thinking to work up an excellent proposal and then bring it to the international community. So yes, I've seen multiple times, if a state really has a good, sound, rational proposal for reform, works up a good technical proposal, brings it to the international community, it is often successful if they do it correctly, because there's now sort of a science of multilateral diplomacy. The Marshall Islands, in the lead up to the 2015 Paris Agreement, it's a tiny country, had a huge impact. They built a coalition behind the scenes with other like-minded states in advance of the 2015 Paris Agreement talks on climate, and increased the ambition of the whole treaty, process, and took everybody by surprise and was incredibly effective. So yes, one country, with also intellectual capacities, a country like New Zealand could have a huge impact. But I think we, you know, these are collective action problems. It's like, oh, who's going to take the lead? You know, I think the international community is used to letting, you know, the larger states sort of set the tone. And obviously that's not healthy if they're backing away from multilateralism or behaving in antisocial ways.
We've got a similar question, I suppose, on a smaller scale, from Marianne, which says, how do local communities become more educated and active in some of these ideas?
Yeah, I think there are excuse me, a number of really amazing NGOs working around the world on various issues of global governance. So I think maybe engaging with those networks is really good, or UN societies or associations at the national or regional level, which also need like new injections of ideas and energy and fresh perspectives. So like on that front, I think some of the NGOs are either focused on specific issues, often at the global level, or they're sort of very few focused on comprehensive global governance reform. And that tends to be older generations that are in them, and they're not such, they don't have the new generation sort of taking them forward. So anyways, my point is on the civil society NGO front, I think there's a lot of room to give input from this global governance lens. And I do see a bit of a new generation now building up in the work we're doing and networks we're connecting with, of like a new energy to really think seriously about these issues together with like a very modern kind of, you know, future looking lens, and also like a capabilities, we can do this kind of approach, which I think is quite encouraging, but it needs to be accelerated. Also at the local level, we've produced at the Global Governance Forum, you can check out that website, we have a new website coming out, the globalgovernancesforum.org, I think. Where we've already produced some local discussion materials. It's called 10,000 Conversations on Global Governance Issues. So you can host or facilitate a conversation in your community on these issues, which I think is a nice idea, just to start discussion at the very local level, so everybody can think through together, sort of as global citizens.
Wonderful. Sorry, I just have another one here from Maja, from the other Maja. So she said, you mentioned that leaders tackling global challenges will need to develop new and evolved skills, new ways of thinking and qualities. What do you think are some of the most important skills, ways of thinking and qualities that are needed?
Yeah, I think there's a whole range, and probably they're perhaps inherent in, you know, good leaders we've had from the beginning of time as a human species. But so you know, integrity, truthfulness, a service orientation. I know for example, you know, Harvard Business Review top leadership kind of articles, the leader servant always comes out as the top type of leader, but of course we don't, in our current society, we don't see that so often. It's quite rare, in fact, to see sort of the servant leader devoted to service and who's humble, who's empathetic, who can listen, who can adapt, who's emotionally intelligent. So I think all of those sort of good qualities of leadership we need. But then, you know, more than that, we of course need people who have been exposed or will expose themselves and learn from, you know, very diverse cultures and circumstances. Like, still in various international institutions, there's you know, colonial or post-colonial dynamics. There's not enough awareness of the histories of various places and peoples and regions. I think that capacity also has been building up in the international system. So that intercultural awareness and sensitivity also to, you know, historic power dynamics, super, super important. Also, you know, this sense of selfless service and striving for excellence versus just careerism or self-interest, again, that we do see sadly too commonly in our various societies. And then qualities to deal with the great complexity of our global challenges. They're not only scientifically complex, technically complex, but we're, as I mentioned, interculturally complex, internationally complex. We have our histories, we have our various cultures, we have our interstate system, we have the legacy of the path dependencies of this, you know, very hardened, formalistic nation-state system, which is sort of like a psychological issue in a way. We have, like, there's so many different complex shared cultural issues we have to confront, in addition to our very complex global challenges. And like multilateral treaty negotiations or multilateral processes are so complicated. They require really, really, really high levels of emotional intelligence and psychological insight. So I think, like, you need leaders with all of those qualities. But I think you see people who do fit the bill more and more, which is good. But the global perspective, I think we're still very much nation state based, and people participating in these negotiations are often like, oh, what is Germany's goal? What is New Zealand's national interest? There hasn't been, you know, a strong enough and big enough shift to consider everything from this international perspective. How do we build, you know, international institutions of excellence? How do we serve everybody with these institutions.
Great, thank you so much. Have another one if you don't mind. So that's what would make nation states get over the barrier of nationalism to global cooperation? Would it be, what would make the nation states get over the barrier of nationalism to global cooperation?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it has to be a number of different things that sort of help nations not like just reconceptualize sort of notions of sovereignty because I think everybody agree that like and for example in the Baha'i writings it talks about healthy nationalism, healthy patriotism, love of one's country is wonderful, it's great, but it shouldn't be a barrier for having solidarity or this this very strong sense of shared human identity. So I think there has to be the recognition that it's not incompatible. If you have really strong, effective global institutions, it's not incompatible with healthy, strong nations where national autonomy is respected and protected. And there's very strong principles of subsidiarity and respect. Again, for the autonomy of states without compromising on our shared international values. So I think the kind of false dichotomy has to be gotten over. Also, I think the notion of sovereignty in international law and generally has become like a very weird fetishized kind of thing, which in international policy circles, it needs to become a bit more sophisticated and less hardened. Like it's become a very superficial notion in many ways. It isn't very sophisticated. And I know in the European Union, for example, a number of scholars have proposed different ways to think about international cooperation, like a notion of pooled sovereignty, where the states of the European Union pool their sovereignties together for common ends. So I think if there can be these different ways of thinking about what we're doing together, that can be really helpful. And I think at the end of the day, just logically, you saw, some of those global challenges that it's completely foolish for any individual state not to want to solve them in their own national self-interest. So I think the inherent logic of what we're facing at the planetary level will cause, a cascading rethinking. But I think we need like imaginative political scientists and lawyers and policymakers to really think together about how we think about stronger international cooperation and just not make it like an either or zero sum. Either you're you love your country, or like you're a globalist, or you love your country. It's very simplistic and very unhelpful.
Thank you. Sean, I know you have a question if you'd like to ask Maya.
Thank you, Sophia. I've got a question for you, Maya. In your presentation so far, you've mentioned Johann Rockstrom, you mentioned the planetary boundaries, you've mentioned peace. All those terms are included in the documentary, the link that I've posted about the Earth lawyer called Polly Higgins, who died last year, and her concept of ecocide. And there's a documentary about her that you can find online. Part of her work was that she was advocating that ecocide be made the fifth crime against peace in the International Court of Justice. And she did work with Pacific Islands, very close to New Zealand. And she's advocating that all it took for an amendment to be placed at the UN court, the UN would be for one nation to table the amendment, and the members would vote on that amendment. What, in your view, are the barriers to that taking place? Is it because some nation states might also be subject to an ecocide law that it doesn't proceed, or you know, what is it, because there are special interests who are opposed to it, who are, you know, in the pocket of governments, or, you know, what if there's major polluters who are responsible for the large amount of emissions that are impacting on the world internationally, but Ecocide could be a deterrent to that. You know, why do we not proceed? And, you know, what would it take to honour her work and to try and to get that to make ground? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Sean. And I've actually spoken recently to some of the advocates who have worked with Polly Higgins or on her campaign. But I think their work is going on. And as far as I understand, and I haven't looked deeply into the campaign, so I'm just a grain of salt. I haven't, looked thoroughly into the campaign. But as far as I have understood, it's a campaign at the International Criminal Court, which is a different court of the International Court of Justice. But strengthening the International Court of Justice, for example, would strengthen all global environmental treaties immediately, just FYI. So the putting the crime of ecocide into the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court would be a step, but there's also other things to really increase the international community's accountability for environmental obligations and matters. But the Ecocide, as last I've heard, there hasn't yet been a state at the ICC who has proposed adding the crime of ecocide to the Rome Statute, which indeed, as you suggest, any state can make a proposal, and then it depends if there's support or not, whether it's adopted. There are some issues about how to define the crime of ecocide. I have not seen really thorough, it doesn't mean they don't exist, but I have not seen like really thorough elements of the crime of ecocide, what it would specifically contain, and how easy or hard it would be to prove and adjudicate, and for judges to actually decide whether an individual has, you know, committed ecocide or aided and abetted ecocide, etc. So there might be problems in how to design ecocide as a specific enough crime, although there might be some great proposals out there. Then also the ICC at the moment is also very overstretched with its current mandate. So it's been a challenge for the International Criminal Court to really wrestle with, you know, the core issues and crimes currently under its mandate. So adding another major international crime might be a very, you know, heavy lift for the states and for the court infrastructure itself. It's not an environmental court. So in that respect, some proposals for a new focused environmental court might be more effective if you really want to regulate the global environment in a more systemic way that has environmental law specialists working at that court. Or also, you know, courts do post facto justice after crimes have been committed. Right now, what we need is a lot of prevention of you know, ecocide, you know, as it's defined, and we need to implement the precautionary principle so that we prevent egregious environmental damage or risk. So, you know, maybe an international environment agency strengthened body to proactively prevent such destruction behavior is better than just prosecuting people after the fact, given that, you know, some of the environmental damage that we're seeing could be irreversible, you know, for example, the planetary weather system. So these are some of the issues I think that are at play. There are others. However, the crime of ecocide has captured like a lot of imagination of people, because people are aware of sort of all the genocide campaigns and really also people are so worried about global environment that this, you know, captures a lot of the sentiment of this should be forbidden at a very high level and should be considered a crime against peace, which, you know, that's sort of a natural evolution. I agree. But then how we actually properly design a proper global environment governance system, I think it will need a range of different pieces and mechanisms. Oh, one last point on Ecocide, that the president of, or it was Macron in France, head of state of France, Emmanuel Macron, said a number of months ago that he supported instituting a crime of ecocide or developing one under French law, and that he was also champion ecocide at the international level. So I don't know where that's gone or if this was serious, but you had one state that was backing this concept, at least in word, from one actor.
I guess the positive thing about that is he would be one of those major nations who are on the core committee at the UN that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, exactly. As I said before, you know, one nation can do a lot if they put their mind to it. Absolutely. If France is able to really develop a sensible, coherent crime with appropriate specific elements, and then you know, build a coalition of other countries that are like-minded. Yeah, I firmly believe that one nation, if they have really smart proposals and also a good strategic sense, can achieve a great deal.
That just the last comment from me. That would be transformative, because New Zealand and France have a real history with regard to their nuclear testing in the 1970s and 80s at Mururoa, and so that would be a change to the French New Zealand history. I'm just speaking as the everyday New Zealander, you know, who's aware of that background.
Great. Sorry to cut that short. I'm just conscious that we have quite a few more questions to power through. Thank you so much for your question, Sean, and thank you, Maya. So another question is, what has been the historic relationship between the Baha'i International Community Office with the United Nations, and what has been its impact, and is there the intention of strengthening or increasing the collaboration between the Baha'i International Community and the United Nations?
Okay, well, I can sort of tell you anecdotally and from my professional experience what I know on that topic, but yeah, please ask staff members of the BIC this question if you want a deeper answer. But as far as I understand, the BIC has been really active since even charter negotiations and the early days of the UN, which is quite amazing and quite incredible. And from my, you know, interactions or, you know, some various collaborations with the BIC, working with them on occasion, they can play a really wonderful convening role and a facilitation role to bring diverse groups together. They're often very trusted in the NGO community to be sort of a neutral arbiter and sort of a neutral facilitator. So I think that role has been very powerful and strong, because it's about building relationships, it's about building trust, and putting forth values-based policy suggestions. In terms of increasing collaboration, you'd have to ask Bani or someone else who's, you know, working daily with the BIC if they have any interesting plans. But yeah, I mean, the BIC is very engaged and sponsored some really wonderful discussions in the lead up to the UN 75th anniversary. So I would imagine also it's a matter of, you know, human power and staff members, how many staff BIC can have to sort of engage with different discourses and processes to try to, again, you know, really think about the long-term well-being of humanity and propose, you know, very clear values-based policy suggestions based on this, you know, notion of the deeper unity of humanity.
Thank you so much. So just the last question before we wrap up. So how can the UN move on from being overstretched and underfunded without its present challenges being seen as increasingly undermining its effectiveness as an institution?
Maybe I'll just look at that question from being overstretched without it.
I'll just copy that into the chat.
Oh, without it undermining effectiveness.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would increasingly undermine. So like how does it get itself through this tough time when we have these mushrooming global challenges, where now we have this intense global pandemic, and then knock-on economic effects around the world, which might, deepen in terms of economic crisis. We'll just have to see how we all collectively muddle through. I think the UN is probably in a similar situation to many national governments or regional institutions and companies, for example. We'll just have to see how we all together ride out these current very imminent circumstances. And then, of course, we have the waves of climate change related effects starting to hit countries on a more regular basis. So it's a difficult, very difficult problem set. However, we still have a lot of money in the world. We have a ton of money flying around the world all the time. So if the international community was smart, it would find new ways to, in a rule-based, transparent, legitimate way, increase the coffers in our collective, for our collective resources. And we have a whole chapter in the book, I think it's chapter 12, on funding, which has some very moderate, very easy proposals to increase the UN funding in a very quick way that's not a burden on any nation state. So again, I would say on the funding perspective, on the funding issue, if states take like a proactive global approach, there are a lot of potential sources of very legitimate ways to raise funds for international work. One example I'll just leave you with is one that the previous foreign minister of Canada, Lloyd Axworthy, shared on a webinar about a week ago, which is completely brilliant and wonderful and exactly the way the international community should be thinking. It's to unfreeze or to unleash the assets, the ill-gotten assets of corrupt officials around the world that are now sitting in, Swiss bank accounts or wherever, various, tax havens around the world, and use this money to help refugees around the world, because now that money for refugees is drying up, but that money could also be used lots of other places. So that's exactly the way the international community, there's so much corruption, there's so much, dark money around the world, there's, all these huge holes in our international tax system, or like our which is undermining national ability to collect taxes. So there could be, a mega committee with lots of different subcommittees on devising really brilliant, effective ways to just get, enough money and a lot of money to put towards our global challenges. So it shouldn't be a problem, but I think states have to think internationally as well as nationally.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Maja. We all really appreciate your time and your insights. And again, I wanted to congratulate you on the book, but also for being the co-winner of the 2018 New Shape Prize for Global Governance Innovation, which is a huge achievement. So well done for that. And I would encourage everyone to read the book. It is very informative, it is very thorough, very, very interesting, and it covers a lot of different topics.
And just one point, Sophia, it's also available for free on the Cambridge University Press website. So we made sure it was open source so that it could be part of, you know, broad consultations with everybody.
Perfect. It's accessible. There we go. We'll try and provide a link to the book as well. I'm sure you can download it and have a read of it. So yeah, thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for your questions and the really thoughtful answers. We all really appreciate it. So I'll leave you all. Thank you for joining. Hope you have a good
Great.
night.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Mark. Thank you everybody for joining.
Thank you so much, Maya.